Welcome to the Wildlife for You podcast and the Old Man Johnson series. Alrighty, folks. Welcome to that Wildlife for You podcast and the Old Man Johnson series. I'm your host, Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist by trade, and I like to think I'm a defender of truths and sworn enemy of misinformation and nonsense by night, especially when it comes to wildlife topics.
Wow, that actually sounds pretty intense, like spandex cape wearing kind of intense.
Well, obviously, folks, you see I am joined here by my brilliant and brainy friend and co-host, Stephanie Payne.
Who does not wear a cape?
I wish you did sometimes. But anyway, we are here on this podcast to debunk those crazy and unfounded claims about Mother Nature and wildlife, most of which come from our good friend and everybody's grandpappy, Old Man Johnson. Steph, is there anything you'd like to add before we jump into today's topic?
Nope, other than I am not really a cape wearing kind of person. But Dee, if you recall, we recently had a talk with Old Man Johnson the other day, and he gave us quite an earful. So do you want to share with the audience just a little bit of our conversation?
Yeah, sure. That's kind of what we're here for, because we actually did have a talk with him about one of our favorite critters, which is the gray wolf, which so happens to be a pretty controversial apex predator. And I will say, I want to call him OMJ for Old Man Johnson. I will say, Old Man Johnson's pretty opinionated. And here's the thing, folks. Opinions are fine to have. We want people to have opinions. After all, they're your feelings towards any particular topic. So we're not here to tell you what opinion you're supposed to have on wolves or any other species for that matter. We just want to make sure we debunk any misinformation that's out there, because sadly, opinions are sometimes formed on like half truths or misunderstandings in general. So I think you'd agree, Steph, folks should have the best information available before forming their opinion.
I agree.
So do you remember what Old Man Johnson had to say about wolves in the lower 48?
I would, you know what, just lay it on me with your very bestest Old Man Johnson voice.
Okay. I've been working on this, so I'm going to have to get close to the microphone because this is sometimes hard to do. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let me lean in.
Well, now, Miss Stephanie, you know good and well that whole timber wolf thing out west was a bad idea. Not only did they bring in the wrong kind of monster Canadian wolf, but them there wolves are vicious, I tell you. You know, they's kill for fun and will wipe out all the other critters out there. Yep, bad idea reintroducing them wolves. But that's the government for you.
Oh my gosh. It actually did hurt a little bit.
Wow. Like, I mean, seriously, wow. Like it was all I could do to control myself right there.
I saw
You're,
that.
yeah, you're, you're really getting good at that Old Man Johnson voice.
Thank you. I've been practicing quite a bit lately. I didn't even give myself a hernia too much there. So with that, did you capture it? Besides you laughing, recalling what Old Man Johnson said, what did you have to think about what he had to say about them there timber wolves?
Okay, so well, for starters, it was hard. I was snorting inside my own mind here, laughing so hard. So, but truthfully, there's a lot to unpack right there. So let's see. He mentioned a few things that I'd love to double click on and take a deeper dive into. So he started off by saying the wrong kind of monster Canadian wolf. So I think we can explore that a little. And then he went on to say that wolves were like vicious and kill for fun. So we definitely need to address that. And then he even mentioned they kill out all the other critters. So we need to address that one too. But yeah, he's got a lot going on in those overalls of his. And I think we need to touch on those. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with the very basics for our audience and explain like what we're even talking about here, because some people may need to know the basics. And I will say when I when I introed it, I said about wolves in the lower 48. That's kind of where the controversy kind of comes in because, well, you want to give a little bit of history or you want me to?
Um, I mean, I can hit the high levels, and you chime in more where we need to go deeper. So, obviously, gray wolves were all across North America. When the early Europeans came over, they did what they did, right, which is not it's not isolated to just wolves, but they really waged war on predators, wolves being very key among those. There was, different programs, some even sanctioned by the government, with bounties on wolves. So you know a bunch about that. Tell me about that part.
Yeah, like a lot of people think killing a wolf involves shooting, which obviously that had happened. But in order for Europeans who did not take kindly to having wolves around because they saw them as competition, and understand gray wolves, that species, it circumnavigates the globe. It's not just in North America. They're in Europe and Asia. So Europeans were well aware of wolves, and that's where you get the legends and lore, the big bad wolf ideas. When you were a kid, you were taught that wolves are a bad thing. Like so many fairy tales just describe this like really bad monster type of animal. And so when early Europeans came to North America and they saw that gray wolves pretty much were on that North American continent, they waged an all out war on them. And so obviously shooting wolves was something that like they initially started out, but you can't really do too much damage if you're only shooting wolves. They're really, really elusive. And so one of the ways that was much more effective for getting rid of wolves was trapping. And we could have a number of different podcasts about trapping, but trapping is much more effective because you don't have to be present on site all the time. But there is a new innovation that really wiped out not just wolves but lots of other creatures, and that was this idea of poisoning them. So wolves tend to be scavengers. Like if there's a freshly killed carcass, they will come in and investigate and feed on it. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was lots of people, especially those pioneers moving out west that did not want to compete with wolves. They're putting arsenic out there, poison that it was indiscriminate, but they would take if a cow was killed, especially, but any type of carcass that they knew these predators would come into, they would lace it with this very, very potent and deadly poison, and it did a number on wolves. And so by that early 1900s, by 1950s, wolves were pretty much wiped out of the lower 48. And I got to stress lower 48. Wolves have always done really well up in Canada and Alaska, but in those lower 48 states, they're pretty much gone. Now, you will hear stories every once in a while of there was a couple of wolves that hung on in Glacier or maybe in those Midwestern Great Lakes states. But for the most part, they were non-existent. And I don't recall the exact date, but even in Yellowstone, they were completely wiped out.
So here's a
And
question. When you say
yep,
they were when they were nearly wiped out, so in our bio lingo we call that extirpated. So
yep,
like locally extinct, I guess you could
yes.
call it. So if they were extirpated from the lower 48, talk to me about because you just said excluding Canada and Alaska, but what about just out of curiosity, Eastern Canada, where there's a higher density of people? Was it same problem there,
Oh,
or
yeah,
was it pretty
yeah.
much
Put it this way: what it boils down to, Steph, is where the people singular, I guess. No, wherever you find people, you're not going to find a lot of wolves. So in that far eastern Canada, especially my neck of the woods, I came from Buffalo, New York, and I was just right across the border from Toronto. That St. Lawrence Seaway, lots of animals there that we typically think that early Europeans wiped out in the U.S. They were extirpated from that portion of Canada as well. Now, obviously, Canada is less densely populated than the U.S., So wolves hung on in the province, some of those provinces like Ontario, really, really, really big provinces. They're huge. And so those northern parts, they've always maintained wolves. But as you move southern in that, getting closer to the U.S. border, which is where most of the Canadian population resides, yeah, those areas were pretty much wiped out of wolves too. So
And
wherever you
just
found
for
people,
where you found people, you didn't find, but just for clarity, we didn't find predators pretty much, right? Like any kind of
well, yeah,
apex
oh
predators.
yeah,
So,
we're talking about wolves on this episode, but they wiped out all sorts of critters. Like you talk about what happened in the U.S. So we wiped out cougars in the east. We wiped out most of the black bears, or very, very small populations. Like grizzlies used to wander all the way over towards the plain states, almost all the way to the Mississippi River. But those were all pushed back. So as the people moved westward, we kind of left a trail of extirpated animals along the way.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay. That
so,
makes sense.
so this led this kind of all-out war we had on predators, and in particular, since we're talking about wolves, this led this left this huge void for like the last half of the 20th century. And so the US government started thinking about the possibility of reintroducing gray wolves into the Yellowstone ecosystem. So a lot of that work started late 70s, early 80s. Obviously, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of environmental impact statements type of stuff. And so finally in 1995, they actually reintroduced gray wolves into the Yellowstone ecosystem. Um, Before I go too far, I keep mentioning gray wolves. We should probably mention that when you're looking at North America, there's only one species. Well, there's two species of wolves: gray wolves, which pretty much ruled most of North America. And then there's
Wolves.
the red wolves, which were in the southeastern. The thing when you get into genetics, it'll change. Like what we're talking about today might change in 20 years as more and more genetic ancestry is uncovered. But the only two species of wolves we have in North America, as we're speaking now, are gray wolves and these red wolves. Red wolves are almost gone. There's only about 2 dozen left on the coast of North Carolina, but they're much smaller. They're kind of, imagine like a cross between a gray wolf and a coyote. That's kind of what a red wolf looks like. But the rest of North America has always had the gray wolf, Canis lupus. That's the scientific name of it. So anyway, 1995, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got together and they reintroduced gray wolves into that Yellowstone ecosystem. So,
And I really want us to probably talk more about that in a minute because that's a big topic that I think I'm going to like. But circling the block back to Old Man Johnson real quick. Let's talk about that whole monster Canadian wolf comment that OMJ made. And I've heard way more people than just Old Man Johnson mention this, but I wanted you to explain that a little bit, please.
sure, that's pretty simple. And I guess is fortuitous that I just mentioned about that that one species, the primary species of gray wolf. And so what we're dealing with here is people getting confused about subspeciation. So many people think that this Yellowstone wolf reintroduction, that we released a different kind of species of wolf, but we didn't. It was a different subspecies or variety. Since the wolves that were originally in that area of Yellowstone, they were completely killed off. And so we more or less got the next closest wolf available, which came down, which was from Canada, because that's where those wolves had a foothold.
So when you talk about the subspeciation, I think we're probably going to end up diving into that a little more because that's a little more sciencey. So we probably need to give our listeners a better definition of what subspeciation is and maybe some other examples too.
Okay. Um, think of your science class. A species is defined as a group of animals that are so similar they can mate with each other. And here's the key thing, produce viable offspring. And so you can't
What
take
is viable offspring, sir? Because
viable offspring means if the two animals mate, they will produce offspring that can then mate and produce more offspring. Because sometimes you can cross animals that might not be of the same species and they'll produce offspring. But in most cases, those animals will be sterile and they cannot produce.
jackasses, ligers. I mean, yeah,
What do
everybody
you
in the
what do you call me
Napoleon.
already?
Yeah.
I refuse to be
Anyway,
called a liger.
but yeah, since the Napoleon Dynamite, I think we all know what a liger is now. But yeah, okay, carry on.
So so there's this idea out there that there's these all these different kinds of wolves out there, but what we're talking about, this subspeciation, is where it's all the same species, but because of potentially geographic differences, or potentially, well, along with geographic differences, you often have differences in diets. And so even though they're the same species, they could appear a little bit different. And I'm going to use a big word, phenotypically. Like they might look a little bit different. That's all phenotypic is. Genetically, they're identical, but they might look a little bit different. And a good example, and I hate to use it, but a good example, you look at grizzlies. Do you know what the scientific name for a grizzly is?
Ursus arctos horribilis, right?
Well, Ursus arctos.
Horribilis.
Yeah, Ursus arctos is the genus and species. Now you have, and that's a brown bear, also known as a grizzly. You take that brown bear that's in the Rockies and you look at a brown bear that's up in Alaska. What are those bears in Alaska feeding on?
Salmon,
Yeah,
grasses.
they got a much more nutrient rich, power packed diet. And so they will appear, they could be a little bit larger. They appear a little bit different than those interior grizzlies that you find in Yellowstone. They're the exact same species. They can mate, they can produce viable offspring, but they might look a little bit different. Now, I will tell you, I've been talking about this quite a bit recently, and a lot of people tried countering me because I tell them in most situations that subspeciation, or we also call it the different variety, they're just real subtle differences. And oftentimes, like those geographic subspecies, their ranges overlap. So like right on the fringes, you can't even tell if it's this northern kind or the southern kind. Um, and someone recently posed, well, that's a bunch of bull because you look at dogs, like domestic dogs, and a Saint Bernard looks a whole lot different than a pug.
But that's not a fair statement, right? Because we genetically engineered those buggers to look exactly like that for a few thousand years.
Exactly. And do you know what those different types are called?
The breeds?
Yes. Breeds is pretty much the same thing, but a breed is one that's manipulated by humans to produce a desired outcome. Now, subspecies or varieties, they're different because they're not modified by man. It's just modified by some of these geographic differences. And so you do get subtle differences within a species because of where they live or what they're eating. And so this is where it gets convoluted, and you could look up and we could argue all day long. We used to like look at a wolf from the Arctic and a wolf from down in near Mexico, and they look very different. And so we would classify them as different subspecies. It got so I think every scientist wanted to have their finger in the pie, and they would describe a different look, different. And I think at one point there's like 32 different subspecies of wolves, and then it got boiled down, lumped together. But there are some like noticeable differences between what's remaining. I think about 8 are remaining now. I don't even know for sure.
So that for our average listeners, so the difference is back in the day, before we had the ability to do genetic testing on things, we went by what they call phenotypic. So with whatever looked different. So if it looked different enough, it qualified. So like Daryl said, if you could go out there and you could express enough for differences with what your eyeballs were looking at, or some other visual feature of the animal, for the most part, that's called a phenotypic difference, and that's what made the speciation that they were calling out, or subspeciation in this case. But on the flip side, as soon as we got the ability to start doing genetics, that's when we were able to swab their little gum lines and send that off for testing. And then the next thing you know, we're like, okay, actually, these are the same species.
Yeah. And what's the big one in your favorite feline world?
The cougar. Yeah, there
Yeah,
was a
we pretty much
blue
found.
billion. Yeah,
Yeah, there's
everybody
all
thought
these
there was a
different.
blue billion cougars. And even now, you'll find people that argue that want to say that the Florida panther, which is a cougar, for the record, just by a different name, cougar by any name is still a cougar, and they want to say that those are a different species. But that is exactly what you were talking about. They're separated by a pretty big geographic barrier between them and the next population they could breed with. So they were genetically isolated, right? They're interbreeding with each other, which means the traits started to express, and they look a little different, a little smaller, a little more slender, but they're still genetically the exact same creature. And they breed with the Texas ones and have viable offspring.
Yes, and that
Further
did
evidence.
wonders for that.
It did.
So going back to this whole wolf idea. So we being early Europeans, we wiped wolves out of most places in the lower 48. So now we want to return wolves to the landscape, and we want to put some in Yellowstone. Well, guess what? The wolves that were in Yellowstone no longer exist. At that point, I think they were classified as Canis lupus eremotus. It was like a northern, it was a Rocky Mountain wolf, but that subspecies was completely eliminated. There are no more of them. Like, we completely killed them out. So we had to grab the next closest thing. And obviously, we're getting some of these wolves from Canada. And they tend to be slightly larger. It's not like a monster Canadian wolf like Old Man Johnson said. They could be slightly larger, but my biggest pet peeve when it comes to this is why is it the big bad wolf? Where I'm going with this, Steph, is we wiped out elk, deer, turkey, all these big critters that were on the land. And then we're like, what are we doing? We got to bring them back. And so we started all these restoration projects, and we moved like the elk that are now in New Mexico are Rocky Mountain elk. They didn't
Hey,
have.
that's where my Tennessee elk are from.
Yes, you should have. We should have restored the eastern. I think is Manitoban. The eastern subspecies of elk to Tennessee. But guess what? They're gone. So we grabbed the next best thing. And same with New Mexico. New Mexico used to have a subspecies called Merriam's elk, but they were completely killed out. Like, we were restocking like these different subspecies of elk, different subspecies of deer, different subspecies of turkey, all over the place. And mum's the word. That's okay. That's okay. Oh, but you're doing a different subspecies of wolf. That's bad. My thing, why are wolves getting picked on?
Is that like a legit question? Because I
Well,
mean, they're not the only thing that gets picked on, right? Like, if you look at any other type of predator reintroduction, there's going to be controversy. Well, actually, there's
well,
probably controversy with a lot,
oh,
but the predators garner a lot of reaction.
okay. I agree with you. The predators garner reaction, but all right, Steph, you're a woman. Why does size matter? So, and where I'm get wait, no, where I'm going with this is wolverines, much smaller animal. There's talk now of restoring wolverines in some place. Not that That's not that big of a deal. It's like, good job. Fishers are coming back in a lot of places. Massive predators, but they're tiny. Well, I shouldn't say tiny. A wolverine could be somewhat big. Okay, what about eagles? Eagles are like crazy predators, and it's like, hooray, they're eagles. We got to restore them. Tons of fish are predatorial fish. So you have all these predators that we've restocked and restored, but the wolf is a bad one.
The
That's
wolf, the wolf, the cougar, anything that's large enough to also put a specific fear into a human being is probably going to also be something that again garners a lot of attention.
yeah. No, I don't think people think about that. The fact that we've restored lots of predator species, and there's like nary a word, but now there's another predator species. And I think you hit, and that's a really good point, is because they're large enough to have an impact on humans potentially. You don't get killer trout out there nibbling on your ankle. uh,
I mean, but like there's probably some miniature poodle like person that is like freaking out that the eagles were reintroduced to their area or whatever coming back. So
yeah, so I just want to point that out in that the larger predators tend to get a little bit more guttural reaction, but it's really cool to think about that there's lots of other predators that we've restored that we just don't pay any attention to. So anyway, this is really good stuff. But what I want to do, Steph, I want to touch on something else that Old Man Johnson said that I'm sure is bound to get under your skin.
which part is that, sir?
If you recall, and I could always do that voice again, but I really don't want to. But at one point, he said wolves were vicious and they kill for fun. So you want to chat about that for a little bit?
I mean, so I think that this is a pretty big conversation piece that we can have as well because the killing for fun is that's kind of a human ideal, a human construct because um there's reasons why animals do things they don't just run willy-nilly for lack of a better term, and they're not good or bad. So yeah, let's double click on that one.
Okay. Well, you just mentioned good or bad. I I think those are human terms. Like you can't say this animal is good or this animal is bad because what we're doing is we're basing it on human reactions to their behaviors. An animal that kills another animal is just doing what it needs to do to survive. It's not thinking good or bad. It's like thinking, I'm hungry right now. I'm going to eat another animal. And so we often tag these creatures, whatever critters we're talking about. And again, we're talking about predators here. They often get a bad rap because we
By the
think,
complexity of human emotions into their actions, and they're animals, not humans.
yes. And what about this idea of killing for fun? And I think what they might be referring to whenever you hear people say that, you know what surplus killing is?
Mm-hmm.
You want to
Yep.
describe that?
So that's, well, I mean, it's surplus killing. So it's killing more than what you actually
It's
require at that
surplus.
moment. Yeah, it's more than what they need at that very moment. But there's a logic behind that madness if you are a wolf trying to survive in the wild. So
So okay, let me ask: when does it typically occur?
when like wintertime, when the food is scarce, right? Like that's when they're packing up for, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times, if wolves are hunting larger prey, so deer, elk, a lot of times in the wintertime, you get some really tough winter conditions, and you might have a group of animals stuck in the snow. Like
Mm-hmm.
not stuck, they can move, but they can't run very far. And so when the wolves encounter these animals that really can't move very well, they're going to wipe out as many as they can. And that's typically what we call the surplus killing. Besides not being able to run away because of deep snow, can you think of another type of animal that might not be able to run away?
So I mean, you're going to be looking at all the usual suspects, the weak, they're weak because they're old, they're sick. Sometimes you probably get young in there too, but it's going to be the ones that are not
Well,
less
think
likely to survive.
think non-wildlife. livestock
Oh,
if they're
gotcha.
penned
Okay.
in. So
Yeah.
you get animals that might be penned in a smaller type of area. They can't go anywhere. It's easy pickings, and so a lot of times it happens most often with like sheep, where wolves could get in there and really kill a fair number of sheep. Much larger flock, they disoriented, they might be penned in, and so when you have these animals, these predators killing a large number of animals, so many people, again, we're putting human emotions to things, and we're saying that's surplus killing. That's needless. They're killing for fun. And you mentioned it in the wintertime. If a pack of wolves kill a number of animals, especially in the wintertime, guess how long that food's going to stay in the landscape?
On that in that natural refrigerator for quite
Yes.
some time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, those animals may move off and go elsewhere, but if they come back, there is still a fresh supply of meat. Now, and you know as well as anyone, nothing goes to waste in Mother Nature. They're going to be
I was
feeding.
I was going to bring that same thing up because it's like we can't forget that it's not just themselves that they're feeding for right there. There's all of those residual animals that are going to feed on these
Those
things
other
too.
nasty critters like eagles and wolverines, and fishers, and all those other predators that will scavenge on that stuff. And so it's not because they're ruthless killers. There's an evolutionary strategy to it. So they could very well sustain their whole pack for the winter. They might not, but there's a really good chance. Like if the pickings are slim over the mountain, they could always come back and they still got all that food waiting there in the winter. So anyway, that is one of the things that I hear quite a bit in this argument is that wolves are vicious and they just kill for fun. And I just don't agree with that. Wolves are wolves, just like an eagle is an eagle and a weasel is a weasel, and that's what those animals are. It's not good or
Yeah.
bad.
And then
It's
an
just
ankle
life.
chewing trout is an ankle chewing trout.
Exactly. So this is really really good stuff so far. But before I forget, can we address the last thing that Old Man Johnson said that caught our attention?
We have talked a lot, so remind me.
Well, I think the last thing he said is that them wolves will kill all those other critters out.
Ah, yes, yes. And we can't forget how wolves wiped out all of the animals in North America long before those early European settlers arrived. But truth be told, I can understand why Old Man Johnson might believe what he's saying there. I mean, after all, didn't the elk herds in Yellowstone just experience this tremendous drop in numbers shortly after the release of wolves?
Yeah, and I bet you're itching to dive into this some more since I believe it will kind of lead us into another discussion about one of your favorite topics, which is trophic cascades.
Hmm.
But let's first start with some facts. You mentioned that the Yellowstone elk population took a nosedive shortly after the release of wolves, and I think it was like the northern Yellowstone elk herd was somewhere around 20,000 in the early 90s. And then within a decade or so, I think it dropped to about 4,000 or so. So huge drop. Now, you tell me, was that all due to the release of the wolves?
Uh, I mean, I would like not want to say all. All is a very all is a very inclusive statement, but the wolves definitely played their role in this, right? And you're not wrong.
Absolutely.
This is a conversation I've just been dying to have. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. Tell me or the listeners how wolves impacted the elk.
So I mean, there's okay, so there's a lot of different things that come into play when you're looking at predator prey dynamics or the relationships that go on between predator and prey and how it actually affects them. So there's this phrase that was coined. I hate this phrase. The technical phrase that you'll hear a lot is the landscape of fear. I feel again that that's a little bit of a human constructy kind of thing. So I call it more of an ecological vigilance. So what ecological vigilance is it changes the behavior of the herbivore who was able to just sit there nose down grazing or browsing all day long on their favorite little succulent things. Now they got to actually keep their eye out, right? Like now there's something that makes them stop, look around, move to a different location, not just stay parked in a place like a cow, for lack of a better term. So that definitely impacted the behavior a lot. But yeah, the wolves did have a great thing here there.
Yeah,
Carry on.
and it's not just a one for one. It's not like this wolf or this pack of wolves killed this one elk here. But what you mentioned, the changing of the behavior, and this was pretty impactful. The elk no longer grazed in the wide open areas where there's lots of lush food. And so it pushed them into different parts of their habitat where they needed to stay by cover, because when the wolves came around, they had to get to escape cover, whether or not it's forest or whatever. And so it was actually like that behavioral change in them really affected their diet. And so if you have female elk that are no longer like fat and happy during the calving season, you could also impact recruitment with just the presence of wolves on the landscape. So wolves definitely had a major impact on the elk herds there. But here's what well, I shouldn't say no one. Lots of people consider, the people that actually studied the elk herds, there was some pretty drastic changes in some of the hunting regulations in that area. But one of the most impactful things is that was when we started going into this tremendous drought in the western states. And so you have this new predator on the landscape, but now the food is heavily impacted. And so we saw a tremendous swing in the elk herds. And so wherever those wolves were present on the landscape, 100% the elk were impacted. They didn't wipe them out completely. They reduced their numbers, but they didn't wipe them out completely. And if you look, do you know the three primary states where we have the wolves right now?
Oh, Wyoming, Montana, Minnesota. Where's the third
Well,
one?
I'm talking that greater Yellowstone area.
Oh, okay. So Wyoming, Montana, Idaho.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. And if you look at their statewide numbers, they're almost all over population. But understand that it's kind of like water in a frying pan, where if the elk are no longer here, we're a lot they're there, but in lower numbers. But they're over here where there's no wolves in much higher numbers. And here's what I want: if there's anything I want our listeners to learn, it is so much more detrimental from an ecosystem standpoint. It is so much more detrimental to have too many herbivores, elk, deer, anything eating vegetation. That becomes way more detrimental to the ecosystem than having too many predators. Too many predators will lower the amount of the animals, their prey items. But when you have an herbivore that eliminates the vegetation, that's the base of the pyramid. And you lose diversity, you lose other species, you lose songbirds, you lose beavers, you lose a lot of these other animals when the vegetation is heavily impacted. So having an overpopulation of elk is way more detrimental than having an overpopulation of wolves from
Yeah.
an
Not
ecosystem standpoint.
Yeah, not to mention, I think it's much harder to have that overage of wolves because of, the different management things that go into play to to ensure that that population stays in check. But on the flip side, it's just that, carrying capacity and all that jazz, right?
Yeah. And so I want to ask you this, because I don't want to lean anyone as to their opinion on wolves. You form your own opinion. It's your opinion. But there's some really good arguments on both sides of the topic here. Because one of the arguments now is we wiped wolves off the map in the lower 48 for whatever reason. But the thing is, we have altered the landscape tremendously. There's no more thousands of uninhabited miles of wilderness out there. You have pockets of pretty big areas that can support it, but I don't want anyone to believe that we can return to the way things used to be. That train has left the station.
Yes.
And so there's really good discussion about whether or not certain landscapes can handle another apex predator. Now that leads me. I'm a biologist. I love animals. I love having the full complement of species that were there. Aldo Leopold. You need every cog and every wheel in order for things to function properly. And so I'm a firm believer. But where that leads me is you may, because our landscapes are altered so much, instead of having like crazy amounts of every type of species, we might need to have lower amounts. And so I think management is a key aspect here where you can't just reintroduce something and just leave it alone for it to go willy-nilly. I think there's some level of management that needs to take place, and I'd love to hear your thoughts because you look deep in thought right now.
So I mean, but that's like there's different trains of thought. So like you just said about opinions, beliefs, these things are very, very, similar, except one is much more, more intrinsically driven. So when you start talking to people, and this is what garners those huge emotional reactions on things like wolves and why we have such a polarized societal view of them. But it's kind of like what you were just talking about. So you lean conservationist, right? So you lean, we want all the cogs in the wheel, but we need to manage those cogs to make sure that they all stay aligned for the overall health of the whatever. There's people that lean more the preservationist side, more of the put them here, let them go, don't touchy, completely hands off. But then you've got all of the people, there's a lot of self-interest at play too, right? So you're going to have different beliefs from people who, for example, are farmers as opposed to people who, aren't, or people that there's a lot to unpack there.
Absolutely. And that's why I will never, I would, I would rather listen to the conversation to find out who I'm talking with. Because, like, if I'm talking to someone, I've lived in lots of parts of the country, rural parts, where you have these people that are sustaining themselves because of the way they farm. And so if they lose animals, that is a huge loss. Like, we're talking financial loss, whether or not it's food for the family. So you can't just brush away their feelings toward those. Those are true feelings and they are really impacted. So I think it's always best to have like a wide open discussion. Let's see where we can find common ground. We know we're not going to find everything we agree on. That's out the door. That doesn't happen. But maybe we can settle on something that's palatable to everyone. The best part of coming to a consensus is that nobody's happy, but nobody's
Yeah.
either completely mad either. And so it's a really difficult thing to do in today's world. We live in an altered landscape. And this idea of going back to the way things used to be, that's unreasonable.
I agree that going back to the way things used to be is not just unreasonable, but it's absolutely impossible. Those things aren't there anymore. You can't, you can't do anything about that. But you mentioned to me a quote that you read recently. Because that it kind of fits with what you just said, but it was really well worded. Not that yours wasn't. I don't want to say that.
Are
But
you talking about um,
the two
the quote?
science guys.
Yes, and I just learned this quote. There's been so much discussion about this topic for a long time, and someone posted it. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's gold. And so I wrote it down. The quote was attributed to Frank Egler, who, believe it or not, was a plant ecologist who did some work with Rachel Carson back in the mid 20th century. And then Jack Ward Thomas, who he actually served as, I think, a chief of the Forest Service. But he may have been a professor in the University of Montana or somewhere in Montana. But this was phenomenal because they said they're attributed to saying ecosystems are not more complex than we think. They're more complex than we can think. And so this idea of like we know what's best. I will tell you, I love believing I know what's best. I have been proven wrong so many times. And in today's world, it's like people just fight to be right, but it's okay to be wrong. As long as you're doing stuff that you believe in and you have the best available science and information to kind of back up your position, I'll continue to fight for those things. But yeah, today's world is so complex, and for us to try to think that we can figure out what Mother Nature needs, we're fooling ourselves.
Yeah, I think we've kind of actually said very similar sentiments the last couple episodes. So, yeah. All right. So, I think we've probably discussed this topic to death, and I'm sure Old Man Johnson is going to be pretty mad at us. But I think he does at least appreciate the thought that we put into this and that we aren't trying to vilify anybody. We're just trying to make everybody have some informed
Yeah,
ability to make informed decisions.
yeah, and he's stubborn and set in his ways, kind of like you are too. Well, okay, kind of how I am too. But yes, we're not here to tell anyone you're right, you're wrong. We just want to present some of the facts behind some of the statements when it comes to wildlife or things like that. We just want to make sure people have the best information out there. But when it comes to Old Man Johnson, I love him. He totally reminds me of my dad, and no matter how crazy he sounds at times, I still love him to death. So, are we about ready to wrap things up here, Steph?
I am ready when you are, sir.
All right, why don't you go ahead and lead us out?
Okay. So once again, folks, we so love talking to you about wildlife and trying to clear up some of that misinformation that you hear out there. But we also love listening to you. So if you have any topics that you'd like for us to explore, or you've heard something that an old man Johnson has said that you'd like us to look into, please feel free to reach out to us. You can either reach us through the Wildlife for You Facebook Messenger page, or you can email us at wfyquestions@gmail.com. So that's WFY, Wildlife for You, questions@gmail.com.
And I probably shouldn't say this, but my gears have been grinding with this whole Old Man Johnson because he's crotchety and set in his ways. But I
That is
think
like your dad.
he is. I think I think there's something we need to explore a little bit more here because I'm a scientist, you're a scientist ish. Um, Sometimes we get things wrong. And so there might be another character because Old Man Johnson kind of brings up those old beliefs. But I think there might be a time or two or a podcast or two where we bring up stuff where we pick on ourselves instead of Old Man Johnson. So anyway, uh, as Steph said, you feel free to get a hold of us, and we absolutely love to hear from you with whatever topic ideas you may have, any compliments, and heck, you could even throw a few criticisms our way too if you like. Just send those directly to Stephanie. But we do thank you for listening, and remember, folks, when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge often means their existence. So thank you and be well.